To see people coming in, people here. Today we will be speaking about Szenes. Now, this is a very important class in terms of speaking about great Jewish leader. It's in terms of speaking about history, but it's also very meaningful, especially for people who are from a Hungarian background, because it's also that her story is the story of Hungarian Jewry and what Hungarian Jewry has been through during the Holocaust. So there's a lot about Szenes. There's a lot about a brave Jewish woman, what was going on in Israel at the time during the Second World War. But there's also the aspect of Hungarian Jewry. It's very, her story is very immersed in that. By the way, can everyone hear me? Just want to check by a raise of hand. You hear? Okay, great. Okay, so let's dive right into it. So Szenes. Szenes is someone who left her mark in Jewish history. You go to Israel, you see many streets named for her. There's a school in Brooklyn, I believe, named Szenes. Is it in Brooklyn or Riverdale? One of the two. She left a huge mark on the Jewish people. But we're going to see why and how, you know, what impact she has left on the Jewish people. There's a great, before I start, movie recommendation. There's a great movie you can find on Amazon. It's called Blessed is the Match, and it's about Szenes. It's, I believe, an hour and a half, a great movie about Szenes called Blessed is the Match. And it's somewhat of, it's pretty much a documentary, but it also has, it's not something where there's only talking. So I highly recommend it. All right, so let's speak about Szenes. Szenes was born in Budapest in 1921, and her father was a very upper class Hungarian Jewish family, very well-doing. Her father was a playwright, and they were part of the sort of the high society in Budapest. They belonged to a reform family. And she grew up in this very assimilated Hungarian environment that didn't necessarily have a huge amount of Judaism. Obviously, many of their friends were Jewish, but they were living the life of Budapest. They were climbing the ranks, and they were doing very, very well. Her father was a very well-known playwright. When she was a young girl, Szenes enrolled in a Protestant school, and if you were Jewish, you had to pay triple the tuition. So I know some people complain, rightfully often, about yeshiva tuition, but in Budapest of the 1930s, if you were Jewish, you had to pay triple to attend Protestant school. I mean, you know, there's Jews who go unfortunately, to schools like Trinity and other Christian schools just because of the academics. But so Szenes goes to this school, and because she's so talented, they give her a tuition discount. She only has to pay double for being Jewish. So they give her this discount where she's only paying double. Now, as she starts attending, her life seems very promising because, number one, her father is a very successful playwright. She's a talented girl. They are from the upper parts of society. But a few things happen. Number one, her father passes away, so she's orphaned from her father. And number two, when she's already enrolled in this school, in this very high society Protestant school in Budapest, there's an election for student council, and she wins the vote, but she's told that since she's Jewish, she cannot be the head of student council, and a vote is held again. So it's like they call it a rigged election, because since she was Jewish and she won, then therefore they were not going to let her be the head of the student body. And it's at that point that she really takes a very sharp turn towards her Jewish identity, but specifically towards her Zionist identity, towards being a devout Zionist. And she joins Maccabiah, which was very popular then. She joins the Zionist youth movement, but she also joins these agricultural trainings. So across Europe, there were agricultural trainings for Jews to prepare to move to Israel. It's tragic because most of the participants in the agricultural trainings in Lithuania, in Hungary, in Poland, never ever got to see Israel. They perished in the Holocaust. But there was a huge movement to train in agriculture because the idea was that when you come to Israel, you're going to be well trained, productive, and able to contribute to society. She tells her mother, who is very much wanting to see her daughter as part of Hungarian society. She tells her mother, I'm training to be a farmer in Israel. And as you can imagine, her mom is not thrilled. Her mother says, you know what? I love the idea of you moving to Israel, but what about you just maybe going on and being a doctor in Israel? What about you being a lawyer in Israel? And it basically, her mom's not happy, but she tells her mom, look, nobody needs, I don't know if this is true, but this is what she told her mom. She says, nobody needs lawyers and doctors in Israel. They need people to plow the fields. They need people to build buildings. And so that's what she says. I see maybe we have a question here. So if you do have a question, you're welcome to ask. But that is that is her story. Yeah, if you have a question, you are welcome. I see two people asking. Two people asking to ask a question. No? All right. So basically, Chana Szenes signs up to a agricultural school, which is actually very famous. It's a school in Nahalal, and she applies to move to Israel. At the same time, her brother, who also experiences rising anti-Semitism in Hungary, he decides to go to school in Paris. And so in 1939, it's important to understand the Holocaust let me just give a timeline in terms of Hungarian Jewry. The Holocaust for Hungarian Jewry was really, every country in Europe had its own manifestation of the Holocaust and how it came. Obviously, you can't compare the way the Holocaust was for German Jews, Polish Jews, Lithuanian Jews. There were different experiences of the horror of Germany. For Hungarian Jews, it was very unique because the Hungarians, similar to the Italians, were allies of the Nazis in many ways. There was something called the Arrow Cross. And already in 1939, in a voluntary way, they implement rapid anti-Jewish legislation, similar to Germany. But the actual entrance of Germans does not take place until later, we're going to see, until 1944. In fact, Hungarian Jewry is the last Jewish community in Europe to stand, and also the fastest to be destroyed. And so this experience of Hungarian Jewry is very unique. And so Hannah Szenes also in 1939, she sees this immediate rise in anti-Semitic legislation in Hungary, voluntary by the Hungarian government and the people that are there. At the same time, the same Hungarian government, you got to give them credit in some other ways, even though they were evil, that they refused to implement the final solution. So they implemented rapid anti-Semitic laws, but they wouldn't implement the mass destruction of Hungarian Jewry. Anyhow, Chana Szenes receives her certificate. She moves to Israel. And I just want to speak about another point here, and that is many people say, you hear people say, oh, why didn't more European Jews move to Israel before the Holocaust? If people moved to Israel before the Holocaust, then many lives would have been saved. It's important to note that 20 years before the Holocaust, it was forbidden. There was a very strict quota of who can enter Israel. So it wasn't like the gates of Israel have been open to Israel to Jews until the Holocaust came around. There were visas, there were certificates given to people, but it was by no means an open door for everyone. So, but she has a certificate. She completed her agricultural training, and she moves to this agricultural school in Nahalal. And if you want to know where the kibbutz she moves to, it's called Kibbutz Sdot Yam, the fields of the sea. And as you can imagine, it's near the Mediterranean. Does anyone know the song, the famous Chana Szenes song? Raise your hand if you know that.
Eli, Eli.
Yeah, so the name of that famous song is Hahalicha Caesarea, walking to Caesarea. And the answer for that, you can find if you look on Google Maps, you look for where her kibbutz is, where Kibbutz Sdot Yam is, and you'll see that it's 2 minutes south of Caesarea. So that's part of why it's called Halicha Caesarea, because she walked to Caesarea. So Hannah Senesh arrives at the kibbutz, and when she's in Israel, her mind is just becomes an explosion of literary talent. Her father was a playwright, and she very much takes after him. She constantly is journaling. She's writing poetry. And interestingly, Hannah Senesh was so into poetry and writing that when she was 5 years old, before she knew how to write, she dictated to her grandmother poems. So she would tell her grandmother poems. Her grandmother would write it. And you can also see the family culture, right? They're a very, very literary family. And so but when she arrives in Israel, she really has much more time. She moves from kibbutz to kibbutz. She works a lot with chickens, and then she works in different fields. She's enjoying the different kibbutz experiences, but she's at the same time searching for herself. She goes from one kibbutz to the other. She tries, by the way, does anyone know who has a similar experience of arriving in a kibbutz and trying to find themselves, but not finding themselves? Anyone know anybody else? Golda Meir, we're going to talk about it. Golda Meir also arrived. Golda was unhappy with the kibbutz altogether. Golda decided she's done with the kibbutz, and she goes to, Golda goes to the city, to Jerusalem. But Hannah Senesh, I see a question of how old she was. She was around 17. It was right after she graduated high school. And so she's going from one kibbutz to the other, but Sdot Yam was always the place that is her home. She writes letters to her brother. She writes letters to her mother. What happens is in 1940, when the Germans enter Paris, she stops hearing from her brother Giora. And that's when really she starts worrying, meaning it's important to understand that even before the Germans entered a specific country, no Jews in Europe felt safe, and everyone knew there was this kind of horror. The impact of the Holocaust in Germany went to every country in Europe. There were countries like Hungary who, even though they were not invaded by Germany, they implemented the idea of Nazism. And that's an important fact because often you hear certain countries, speak like they were helpless at the hands of Germany, when in fact the inspiration that they got from Germany's anti-Semitism was implemented by them even before German tanks rolled in. What happened is very important now in 1942 is, for the first time, very credible first-hand witnesses start coming from Poland to Israel. And this is when you can see in Israeli newspapers a horror. This is when the Yishuv in Eretz Israel declares a one-day fast, the entire community. It's also important to note that there's something beautiful at the time, because everyone refers to Israel as the Yishuv, which means the Jewish community in Israel, and they act in many ways. We know there's divisions, there's the Irgun, there's the Haganah, but the bottom line is there are many things that the entire community unites. So when they hear that there's a Holocaust going on in Europe, everyone stops what they're doing. There's a day of fast, and everyone has a brother, a cousin, a sister, a parent that's in Europe. And so when the Jews in Israel realize that this wholesale slaughter is taking place in Europe, they decide they must do something. They decide, okay, we cannot stand by when this is happening in Europe. Now, there were different similar situations in the United States in terms of American Jewry, but nothing like what took place in Israel. What took place in Israel at the time, Palestine, what took place there is that the Yishuv, the Jews there at the time in the British, under the British mandate, decided they must take action. And especially with the creation of a new Jew, a Jew that fights, a Jew that is proud, a Jew that is a new kind of Jew, an Israeli Jew, which is something they rightfully took great pride in. They decide it's time to fight back. They decided they have to fight back. And they turn to the British and say, what can we do to help? They turn to the British and see, we want to fight. And so the British obviously are thinking of their own interests. And they say, okay, we're going to establish, there's different Jewish divisions that are established. But one of the things that the British do is they decided they're going to train a group of Israeli, and again, this is before 1948, so it's from the Yishuv, and they decided they're going to train Israeli Jewish paratroopers who will go and join partisans in behind enemy lines, and they will go and help RAF pilots. So there were many, by the way, there's many movies about that. That's a very worthy subject in and of itself, the Royal Air Force and how they defeated the German Luftwaffe. But the bottom line is the UK has many British pilots behind the enemy lines, and they decide we will create a Jewish paratroopers who will be partisans. They'll go behind lines and they'll be able to help the RAF. Obviously, they'll be able to do many other things, but the interest that the British have in mind is helping the RAF, the Royal Air Force. And so Chana signs up, and she signs up to be a paratrooper. And I just want to stop for a second now and say why she's so important. Chana Szenes is important for many reasons. Number one, just the literary skill, the poems, the journaling, the fact that she's from such a young age, you know, so prolific, that's worthy in and of itself. The other thing is the what she does in terms of Zionism. She leaves a very bourgeois, very affluent, very successful family in Europe, and this is before the Holocaust really is on her. She's already wanting to move to Israel. That's another thing that makes her stand out. And then what you have now with her joining this paratroopers force is courage. It takes extraordinary bravery and courage for anybody to agree to be a paratrooper behind enemy lines, much more so Nazi lines. And definitely for a woman at that time to become a paratrooper and agree to go behind enemy lines is just something extraordinary. Now, she says to people, she says, there are two loves in my heart. There's the love of my people, and there's the love of my mother. She loves her mother, and she worries for her, because now the rumors are coming of what the Nazis are doing in Europe, and she's constantly worrying for her mother. She's writing to her mother, or her mother writes to her, but once things get stricter for the Jews, there's only short telegrams, there's no long letters, and so Hannah is going to Europe because she cares for her people, but more so because she cares for her mother. She wants to help her mother. And so she joins this paratrooper training. There's a few hundred people who sign up. There are three women in this huge program for paratrooping. And she goes, she signs up, and she's ready. Okay, now we come really to the I would say the crunch time, where really it's the most intense in terms of what happens. They go on an airplane, they go to southern Italy, and then the British take them. And I'm sorry, I have to add that Hannah does not only train as a paratrooper, she trains as a radio operator. That's very important. She's the one who's going to be sending the signals back to the British High Command or whoever it is that's listening. So she trains in radio. She has with her a radio transmitter, and she goes from southern Italy to Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was unique during the Holocaust in some ways, like Czechoslovakia, because Yugoslavia had many partisans that really were able to control a large amount of those two countries. Really, I must say, had very praiseworthy partisan efforts that were more successful than in other countries. So she was going to go to Yugoslavia. She was going to go and paratroop to Yugoslavia to meet the partisans there. And she does. They go and they paratroop into Yugoslavia. Now, many people, there's actually a horrible satire clip about it that was on Israeli TV for those who saw it. But many people say, like, what was she thinking? Like, why was she going to, like, what did she think? Did she, and this is a matter of decades of discussion. Does anyone want to maybe chime in, maybe speculate? What was she thinking? What was Chana Szenes thinking? Or what was anyone thinking? What were the British thinking? What was the Yishuv thinking when they sent her behind enemy lines to Nazi-controlled territory? Does anyone have any thoughts, ideas? Like, what was the what kind of idea is that? Like, of course, what are there's no chance. She's one person. She's going to go and fight the Germans. Like, what's going on? So there's anyone want to speculate on this? You don't have to be necessarily a military expert, but you're welcome to try and speculate. So, yeah.
I mean, I know that she to use the Morse code, I believe, to communicate, and hence the radio operating. And my guess is if she was from, the European kind of background, she might have known multiple languages. So she might have been able to, I don't know, act, not see a foreigner in some ways. So I don't know if that was at all relevant. I'm sure the mild training didn't help too much, but I wonder if those things might have.
Yeah, so that's very accurate. The training and her radio knowledge. But something very interesting that I didn't know until I prepared this is that it was a good plan because the Nazis had not invaded Hungary yet. And the Nazis, because Hungary agreed early on to be their ally, stayed out of Hungary. And it's at this point in 1944, everyone knows that Germany is going to lose the war. And so it's at this point that the Hungarian prime minister, president, whatever it was, decides that he will tell the Germans to jump in the lake and that he doesn't have to listen to them. And that was a huge, huge, huge mistake, because even though the Nazis were clearly going to be defeated, they were not defeated yet. And so the second Germany hears that Hungary is like, no, we're not listening to you, that is when Germany marches into Hungary, and they control Hungary for less than a year. But it's during that time that they implement the most draconian, quick mass killing of Jews. And so Hannah and her friends land in Yugoslavia with the partisans, and when they land, they are told, did you hear? The Germans invaded Hungary. That was not part of the original plan. They didn't know this. When they jumped off the airplane, they actually had a good plan. She had Hungarian papers. She could have gone into Hungary. Her plan was to spy for the British. It was to galvanize Hungarian Jews for self-defense, which was possible because it wasn't controlled by Nazis. It was controlled by evil people, by the Arrow Cross and the far, far, far extremists in Germany. But it was actually a feasible plan. She was a Hungarian citizen. She would go into Hungary. She would train Jews. She would spy for the British, and that was the original plan. When they land, two of the men that are with her bail on her. They say, I'm sorry, we did not sign up to go into Nazi-controlled territory. We signed up to go into Hungary, and that's a tough decision. Do you go in? Do you not go in? And she, as we know, chose to go in, but they chose not to go in, and they actually, one of them survived. One of them survived to tell the story of her last few months. And so they land and they tell her, they meet up with the partisans, that's successful, and they tell her, we're not going into Hungary. But she decides, because her mother is there, that she will go in. She's determined to go into Hungary. She speaks Hungarian. She has Hungarian papers, and she decides to go in. As they are, as they're going in, she takes out a piece of paper and she gives it to the Israeli that is with her. And she says, take this piece of paper and give it to the members of Kibbutz Sdot Yam. And he's like, this is ridiculous. What is this? He looks at it and it's a poem. And he's like, this is ridiculous. And he drops it. He throws it somewhere in the forest. She crosses towards Hungary. He walks away. After an hour of walking, he feels bad and he feels guilty. And he's like, she did give me that paper and I do need to bring it to the kibbutz. He walks back an hour, and the whole time he's muttering, I can't believe I'm going all this way just for one poem. I'm walking through the forest. And that's the poem of Ashrei HaGafrur, Blessed is the Match, which is her second most famous poem. But you can see how, like, what was on her mind in those last moments was also that she wanted her poem to survive. And she goes in knowing that there's a possibility that she'll die. And she goes in saying a few things. Number one, she says, I want the Jews of Hungary, even if I'm caught, to know that there was a Jew in Palestine who came back, who cared, and was willing to fight for them. She didn't want the Jews of Europe to feel abandoned by the Yishuv of Eretz Yisrael. And so part of why she goes is to strengthen the spirit of the people in Hungary And in that way, it was a successful mission. I'm going to talk about that. She crosses into Hungary, and the moment she crosses in, pretty much, she is caught by border police. They call them gendarmes. I don't know if anyone here is from Europe, but she's caught by Hungarian gendarmes, and they catch her, they investigate her, and they find on her a radio. When they find on her a radio, this is a whole different story. By then already Germany has the Nazis all over, even though it's just a few days later, and they turn her into the Gestapo. The Gestapo are obviously the most cruel people in the world, and they beat her in a horrible way, and they leave her no teeth. And I think something that's very important to be mentioned about her is that she goes through the worst possible tortures with the worst possible creatures on earth. And she never, ever, ever breaks. She never reveals. They want her to reveal the codes to the. She's a big find for them because she has the codes to the British radio, and that's a big deal. And so that's the information they want from her. And they torture her in the worst possible way for two things. Number one, they want the codes to the British radio signal, which is very important. And number two, they want to know where her friends are. On both accounts, she never, from the moment she is caught to the moment she dies, she never ever discloses. And her spirit is stronger than the violence and the viciousness of the Gestapo. She never ever broke, which is something I think is impossible to say for most human beings, but that was her heroism and that was her determination. She never broke. They transfer her to a prison in Budapest. And here's where it's actually a sort of hypothetical conversation historically, but did she help save her mother or not? I would argue she did. They call her mother because they're trying to get the codes from her, and they tell her, if you do not disclose the codes to the British radio, we'll kill your mother right now. And it doesn't succeed. She doesn't break. And they put her in this prison. Technically speaking, before she came in, the British gave her the title of an officer in the British Army so that she's treated as a prisoner of war, but the Germans and Hungarians do not respect this. And she's accused of being a spy against Hungary and the enemy of Hungary, spying, which carries the death penalty. She has a lot of time that she spends in this prison, and there are several people who survived to speak about their experience with her in this prison in Budapest. She comes there. I saw an interview with a woman who was there, and this is just makes you cry because this woman who's a Hungarian Jew who's in prison there asks her, what happened to your teeth? And she doesn't want to scare her. And she's gives her some story about how they fell beforehand. She doesn't want anyone to think that, there's some kind of torture that they'll be through. And when she's there, she gets to see her mother. She spends some time with her mother. It's possible that the fact that she was there led to them holding her mother in prison rather than sending her to Auschwitz. And every single day is important in that sense because Hungarian Jewry had more than 470,000 Jews deported to Auschwitz within months. And by the way, this is a big deal when you speak about the Eichmann trial, the Rudolf Kastner trial. Both have to do with the fact that the Holocaust of Hungarian Jewry, it was so quick, and there were ways to prevent it. So Eichmann, who claimed that he was only following orders, one of the accusations against him was that if it's not only for Hungarian Jewry, he should have been punished the way he was punished and more, because that was preventable. The Russian tanks and the bombers were heard the whole time. Everyone knew that Germany's end is coming. And so the Holocaust of Hungarian Jewry in a way feels with an added tragedy in the sense that it was a matter of months. They were sending sometimes more than 10,000 people a day to Auschwitz. And so it is possible that she saved her mother's life by by coming there, and then the Nazis wanting her mother to be in the prison with her. And so that's a possibility. But they get there in the prison, and the women who were there in the prison speak about her, how everyone looked to her window, and her mom looked to her window, and she, because she was not living in Hungary in the beginning of the Holocaust, she did not have to wear a yellow star. So all of them had yellow stars, but she didn't. But she took her fingers and she colored on the window of her cell a big Star of David. And so they speak about how she strengthened their spirit. She was a very inspiring person, even under the most horrific circumstances. That's when she was in prison. She got to go in the yard of the prison sometimes with her together with her mother and others. So in that sense, it was very important. I want to read to you what she said before she parachuted. There's no turning back for me. If I die, it will not have been in vain. Perhaps the Jews will hear that an agent from Palestine tried to reach them, and they will say, we have to hang on. Maybe rescue is near. And that's the idea that she wanted to give. She wanted to let people know, A, that resistance and fighting is possible, and B, that it's almost over. Because she got to, well, I shouldn't say got, it was a horrific thing, but because she was being tortured by the Nazis, she got out of her cell. She was taken to investigating rooms, and that's when she heard about Operation Valkyrie, the operation to assassinate Hitler. And you can just imagine what it did when she came back to all the other prisoners there and said, guys, there was an assassination attempt on Hitler, and it helped people have hope that the end is near. So that's something that's also very special in terms of how she gave hope to others. A really important point that came up in courts many times later for decades was that the Germans then release her mother, and her mother spares no efforts to save her. She tries to get her a Hungarian lawyer, and she tries to meet with Rudolf Kastner. Rudolf Kastner, for those who don't know, is an extremely controversial figure in the Holocaust. To some people, I actually have met both sides of this on the West Side. Some people had their families saved by him. He did save a few trains of people out of Hungary. Some people accuse him of being responsible for the mass killing of Hungarian Jews because he gave the Nazis the list. He was the liaison of Hungarian Jewry, and many felt betrayed by him. And but he was also a messenger of the Sochnut. He worked for the Jewish agency, and so it was natural that her mother would say, look, there's this guy from the Jewish agency. The Jewish agency is then the government of Israel, and they sent my daughter here. He should meet with me, and he should speak maybe to his buddy Eichmann. Maybe he should speak to the many Nazis that he knows to help save my daughter. But Rudolf Kastner denied her a meeting. Rudolf Kastner refused to meet with Hannah Senesh's mother. And it's something that not only comes up multiple times in the Kastner trial, but it's also something that later Hannah Senesh's mom sues the Kastner family for, because they say that they said some negative things about her. There was a whole defamation case where her mom sued the Kastner family. So this is very, very important because it's just a lot of the Kastner story and trial revolves around Chana Senesh and his refusal to meet with with Hannah's mother. What happens is that eventually she's brought in front of a Hungarian court, and they say you're going to jail you're going to be executed for treason against Hungary. She's not tried by the Nazis. She's tried by the Hungarian pro-Nazi government. And they say, you're guilty of treason against Hungary. And she is very fierce. And she says, no, you guys are the traitors to Hungary. And guess what? She tells them, in just a few weeks from now, you guys will face justice for what you just did to me, because the Soviets, the Americans, whoever it is going to come. And you guys are committing treason against Hungary because you're siding with the enemy, with the Germans. And so she speaks very fiercely, very clearly to them, but obviously they have no mercy, and they end up executing her without any lawyer, without any appeal. They give her the option to ask for mercy and clemency, which she declines. She speaks very fiercely, and she tells them they're the traitors, and that is when she is killed. The story of Hannah Szenes does not end there, because both her mother and her brother Giora did survive. So her mother and her brother did survive. Interestingly, her brother managed to come to Israel right before she left. Like, so the same day she was leaving to Yugoslavia, her brother Giora managed to escape from France and arrive. They have a picture I'm going to show soon, and they survive. So her mother survives, her brother survives, and his children to this day speak about, their family member. So the Szenes family does continue, and she's declared immediately a national hero. Her mom puts a big monument right after the war on her grave. And then in 1950, her body is taken from Hungary to Israel, and she's one of Israel's first official national heroes. Remember, Israel in 1950 is a very young country. You can't really have a national hero when you're 2 years old. I mean, there's the people who are alive and survived the war, but in terms of like legacy of heroism, it's hard to have that when you're just 2 years old. And so she is a national hero. Her coffin is taken to different parts of Israel, and she's buried in Mount Herzl, even though she requested to be buried in Kibbutz Sdot Yam. She's buried in Mount Herzl. They issue stamps commemorating her, and then really what happens is her place is there's been, after she was killed before 1948. Between 45 and 48, there's a ship of people making aliyah under the British called the Hannah Szenes ship. There's many, many things named for her. She's instantly, in her death, she's a hero. And I'm just going to, before I show the pictures, I want to just, again, explain why her legacy is so important. Number one, she has her literary legacy. She has the poems that she wrote. She has her Zionism, her love for Israel, leaving Hungary, coming to Israel, working on the different kibbutzes, and then the heroism. She chooses to go back to fight the Nazis, the courage, the care for her mother. And in that, she also has the refusal and her ability to withstand the worst tortures in the world, not to give away the codes of the British Army, and not to disclose her friends, not to give away any other partisans. And so in that sense, she's a hero. She stands courageously, even though her body was shattered by the Germans. They took out all her teeth. They beat her in the worst possible ways. Her spirit remained very much intact until the very last moment. And her story continued to be a story of heroism. And like I said, it was also during the Kastner trial that there was those harsh accusations between her mother and Kastner. Quick, just to answer a few questions. So what happened to the rest of her family? What happened was that her mother survived the Holocaust. Her brother arrived already before she left to Europe, and her father had died when she was a little girl, and so that he didn't survive. But there is a Szenes family in Israel to this day. In terms of a question in terms of the RAF, why they were looking for paratroopers. Because the idea was there were many RAF pilots who fell in the forest and didn't necessarily die. They teamed up with the partisans. So if you're an RAF pilot and you landed in Yugoslavia, the British Army would like to know where you are and how to pick you up. And so the idea was to send in Jewish paratroopers who want to go and do something, and let them send radio signals. We have here, Sam Smith from London. His plane fell, but he's actually alive, and he's in this forest, to be able to pass on that information. That was one of the main reasons that the British wanted it. Just any other questions I see here? No, no questions in that sense. Let me just quickly show some of the pictures and some of the quotes. I'm not going to play the songs, but I do recommend everyone go and listen to these songs, because the songs are very beautiful. The music in the songs was not composed by her. The music, she wrote the words. Obviously, very, very, most famous one is called The Walk to Caesarea. Eli, my God, shelo yigamer le'olam, it should never be finished. Hachol v'hayam, the sand and the sea. Rishrush el hamayim, the water making its sound. Barak hashamayim, the lightning in the sky. Tfilat Adam, and the prayer of the people. And as you can see, this is in Caesarea because that's where the kibbutz Sdot Yam is very close to. This might make you cry. Here's what she writes in her words when she hears about the Holocaust, and this partially motivates her to go to Europe. She writes, "Lamut tza'ir, lamut lolo." To die young? No, I do not want to die. Ahavti et hashemesh hachama. I love the warm sun. Haor, hashir, nitzot shel zugenaim. I love the light, the sun, the song, and the sparkle of an eye. Velo ratziti heres u'milchama. I did not want destruction and war. Lo ratziti. I did not want. But if she loves life so much, why does she do something as dangerous as going to be a paratrooper? Achim nigzar alai lichyot hayom. If I must live today, b'shefech dam, with bloodshed, beheres hayom, with so much destruction, Agid, I will say, Baruch Hashem ba'ad hazchut lichyot, ubo yavo sha'alamut. So she acknowledges that if there's so much destruction and so much death in the world, I will say, thank God for the right to live, but it may be the time to die. So she didn't want to die. She knew the dangers before she went in. There's a poem that actually was smuggled from her dead body that was on her body after she was killed that her family found, where she says, I rolled the dice and the numbers fell on the wrong odds against me. She did not want to die. She was not like one of these people who were looking for some adventures, but it was really, she was compelled to help her mother. And here you see, here she is, one of her last pictures before she departs. Remember, she was made into officer in the Royal Air Force, just so that the Germans protect her. Here are two quotes that are very worthy of sharing. The voice called and I went because the voice called. And then she says, there are times that one is commanded to do something even at the price of one's life, which is what she has done. And then there's one place in the world which you do not escape, nor do you immigrate. You come home, the land of Israel. It's the recognition. You may have heard of this quote because people say it often. And so that's the idea, where she was persecuted in Hungary, but Israel was the place she felt at home. This picture that you see here is the last picture before she left Israel. So take a look. This is her brother arriving from France. This is her departing to Yugoslavia, to Italy and then Yugoslavia. So it's nice they got one day to overlap, and he survived Nazi France, and then eventually she goes to Europe, and she says, there's no turning back for me. If I die, it will not have been in vain. Perhaps the Jews will say that will hear that an agent from Palestine tried to reach them, and they will say, we have to hang on, maybe rescue is near. You can see here how it was such an official thing when her coffin was brought to Israel. Everyone announced it. And she immediately became such an icon. This is the statue that her mother made in Hungary right after she was killed, and it has these words, Ashrei Hagafrur, blessed is the match. These are stamps for Chana Szenes. There are many of those. And interestingly, to this day, the Israeli paratroopers have, I don't know if it's every year, but you can find it on the IDF's channel. They go to Yugoslavia. Well, wherever it is, wherever it fell, whatever country where she paratrooped into at the time, it's now, because it's no longer Yugoslavia, and they parachute. There's like they go exactly the place where she jumped out of an airplane, and they do the same. So that's the legacy of Chana Szenes. She was a person who inspired many, who symbolizes heroism and integrity and honesty and courage. And she was a person of faith, pride in her Zionist identity and her Jewish identity. And it's just heartbreaking to hear about her last weeks, but it's also interesting to speculate what would have happened without Chana Szenes. Would her mother survive? Would her mother not survive? If her mother survived because of her, that is then that was her intent. Interestingly, just one more thing to add, her mother escaped one last deportation before the end of the war, and then she was sent on a death march to Austria, which she eventually escaped and survived the war. That's the story of Chana Szenes. Again, she's a person who continues to inspire. There's schools in New York, a school in New York named for her. If anyone has questions, comments, thoughts, please do let me know. But thank you to everyone who came and to everyone who listened, and may her memory. Oh, we have a question. Yes.
Not a question. I just wanted you to know that the program for agricultural training by the Jewish Agency was also in Germany. My father-in-law participated in the Hakshara program that was there, but then he ended up turning around and going to the United States, and he was patents. He was one of Patent's top intelligence officers because he spoke German. So he didn't use the agriculture, but he used the training.
I was actually looking for that word, hachshara. That is the word. That hachshara, they would go through agricultural training so that they can go to Israel and build Israel. And very special. It's a special generation, and just it also amplifies the tragedy and loss of the Holocaust, because you see what these young people did and how much they wanted to come to Israel and how much they wanted to build the land, and most of them were killed. So it's also it highlights a lot of the loss. But special people and a very idealistic generation.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone. Thank you so much. Good night. Thank you everyone. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
listening.
Very interesting.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Rabbi, I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
So the 300 people that they recruited to go for the British Army, were those strictly Jews from Palestine, or were they people from other places as well?
It was only Jews from Palestine, because the training took place in Palestine. And by the way, for the record, the British knew that the Arabs, who now call themselves Palestinians, they were siding with Germany outright. And so the only people that the British could train were the Jews of Palestine. And if a Jew lived in Britain or the United States, they can join their local army. But the only people being trained for that program were the Jews of Palestine. Similarly, in World War I, the only thing the British let Jews from Palestine do, was be the donkey. There was Jabotinsky's donkey brigade, where they let the Jews schlep donkeys that had equipment on them. So the Jews wanted to be involved, but were not given a full fair participation.
I have a question about her Hebrew language, since it was so robust and beautiful. Had she studied that when she was in Europe, or only when she went to Palestine?
Good question. I'm not 100% sure, but it is possible that when she had her fallout with the Protestant school she was in, she then joined many Zionist organizations. I don't know if she went to a Jewish school. It's possible she did, but really it's those organizations. Young people then really saw those who were part of the Zionist movement were very idealistic and saw themselves as having their only future in Palestine, partially because they were very idealistic about Zionism, partially because they saw how absolutely racist and anti-Semitic Europe was, and they saw no future there. So it was like a language they learned in terms of a necessity, not a luxury. And so she learned it in those years in Hungary.
And part of these organizations would teach Hebrew. They would teach other skills that were necessary for Israel.
Yeah, from farming, self-defense, making sure people are strong. And those people got the certificates, meaning, and that also enters another very difficult discussion, was that if you wanted a certificate to Palestine, you had to be part of one of these training programs. Not anyone would get them.
Oh.
Is that why Hannah's mother and brother didn't go to Israel? I was wondering why Hannah's mother didn't go with either her or her brother.
So I think her mother didn't want to go, and her brother kind of was trapped like millions and millions of people by the surprise of the Blitzkrieg of Germany. I mean, he went to Paris. But in general, it is true that the certificates were given through the Jewish Agency, and the Jewish Agency had a huge prioritization of young people and people who have training in agriculture. It's a matter of bitter historical record, because you can imagine that if your father, your sister wanted to come to Israel and were not allowed by the Yishuv because they were not agriculturally trained or part of the right Zionist movement, and then they got killed in the Holocaust, you probably, are not happy with that. But that's another very bitter discussion of who got the certificates and how much was allocated. Look, it's understandable that the Yishuv wanted young people who are trained and can do agriculture. That's what they needed at the time. But it's a painful topic, because the real source of the problem is that the British had a white paper with very strict quotas. That's the issue.
But to put it into context as well, wasn't there a very strong Zionist movement throughout Eastern Europe before the war? So where there were people going from town to town, trying to get people to, I guess, to go town to town to get people to make Aliyah. And they were very organized. I know my mother was part of a Hachshara when she was a kid, but that was part of the way Jewish communities in Eastern Europe were kind of preparing post, I'll say, Second Zionist Congress for what they knew was coming.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting with all the discussion today of the history of the state of Israel, when it was founded and why, and the wave of anti-Zionism we see. The truth is that the state of Israel, with its declared purpose and its actual highest need, never happened, because the state of Israel was established and recognized I should say, acknowledged by Lord Balfour, because people knew that Europe was a gunpowder keg that's going to blow up. And in that sense, Israel never fulfilled its purpose, because the idea of many of the early Zionists was, everyone, you had the guy in Spanish Portuguese synagogue who tried to establish a Jewish state in Buffalo, and we laugh at the idea. And you had Herzl trying to establish for some time in Uganda. But the idea was that people realized rightfully that Europe was going to end for Jews. It was clear to so many people that there will be no more Jewish life in Europe. And because of the Holocaust, that purpose was never fulfilled. The purpose of Israel as a rescue place from annihilation, from something like the Holocaust, that never happened. And that's a historic tragedy, which there's many things to blame it on. But the number one thing is that the British lied. And the British said that in 1917, they'll establish a state. In the meantime, they established a dozen of states in the Middle East. From Iraq to Syria to Lebanon to Egypt. They established all these states. And the only state that they didn't establish since 1917 was the Jewish state. So they reneged on their promise. And I actually say this with added passion, because my great uncle, his name was Yosef Lishansky, he was a spy for the British in World War I, and he was hung by the Ottomans, by the Turks, because the idea was they were fighting for a Jewish state, for the British to win, so that the British established a Jewish state, and they didn't, because of the Arab pressure, etc. But that never happened. And so once you have the white paper and a limited amount of certificates, the narrowing was there, and it was such a tiny amount compared to those who wanted, that obviously you have people who are like, wait, why didn't my father, brother, sister get one of those certificates?
But again, the context is important, because you talk about Herzl wanting to establish a state in Uganda, but that was in 1897 when he had a fight about it at the Second World Jewish Congress, because he said, we're done in Europe. So in 1897, he understood that. And so you look at what happened before World War II, there were people who were trying to, in Eastern Europe, and there was a movement to get people from Eastern Europe to move to Israel.
Yeah, and it's I think it's for us to imagine, and it's important to imagine this, what would happen had it not been for the Holocaust and had it not been for the white paper. You would have had millions of how would Israel look today if you had millions of Jews who were trained and motivated and willing to build the land, what would have happened? I think, yeah, you're right. The young Jews at the time wanted hachshara, wanted to be agriculturally trained, and it's just another added horror to the loss of the Holocaust. Yeah. So
I have another question.
yeah.
With the RAF using Jewish paratroopers, I understand why they would do that after World War One, but in World War II, when the Nazis were specifically after Jews, didn't they realize that that was extremely dangerous? Like, did they just not care? Why were they admitting Jews to the RAF at that time?
Right. So the issue is, part of the issue is that the Jews in Israel decided that they have to fight. I think that's one thing. So part of it is that the Jews came and said that we want to be trained. And by the way, without that training, the IDF never really would have picked up. So the Jews came in the 1940s, between 1942 and 1945 to the British, and they got very high quality military grade training. That's one thing. So it's not like the British came to the Jews and said, okay, we want to conscript you. It was more Jew initiated, of Jews coming and saying, wait, we want to go fight the Nazis. That's one thing. And then once that happened, the British, they were making their own calculations of how it can help them, and maybe it can help them with finding their missing RAF soldiers, pilots. That's one thing. The other thing that the British were doing is they prepared for the possibility of Nazi invasion of Israel. Remember, the Nazis came into El Alamein, which is 100 kilometers from Israel's border today. You can drive 2 hours from where Israel is today, and that's where the Nazis got to. And it was entirely possible that the Nazis would have come to Israel, and they spoke about it. And so the British said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to train, we'll do guerrilla training. And that's when they were training Jews all over Israel in guerrilla warfare, in sabotage, and blowing up bridges and stuff like that, because the British were making a plan for the Nazis to, in the case that the Nazis invade Israel and take over. And by the way, since I wouldn't bring this up, but since everyone's kind of trying to revise history in terms of the Palestinians, every British historian can tell you that the reason they gave this military training to Jews is because the local Arabs who call themselves Palestinians now sided with the Nazis. There was no question about that. The British were training the Jews because the Jews were the ones who were going to fight the Nazis. And so, yeah, so there was that double aspect of training for local guerrilla and training those who want to go paratroop.
But to the point you made earlier, Rabbi, it's also that they fit in. The Jews came from those places. They spoke the language. They knew the territory. They were perfect to send in.
Yeah. I mean, also in America, right? Someone just mentioned their father going with Patton. The Jews were, the Jews were very instrumental in helping America against Germany because many of the Jews were German. Whether it's the Manhattan Project, whatever it is, the Jews were very relied on. Actually, it's a matter of another talk I would love to give one day, is how the Jewish mob, Bugsy Siegel and all those people, helped the FBI and the CIA root out American Nazis once America went to war with Germany. But that's actually a very fun subject to discuss, how the B'nai B'rith would give the CIA lists of local German Nazis in Yorkville, and those Nazis were sent to the Pacific. The American army didn't trust them to fight in Europe, so they sent them to the Pacific. But that's another talk.
We'll wait for it.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Right.
Thanks a lot. Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good night.
Thanks.